and welcome to History on Blast, episode 25, The Phantom That Terrified All Arizona. In today's episode, we're going to put the U.S. Army on blast for causing ghost sightings and a cryptid all at the same time. But first, this month in history. On May 14th, 1607, the first permanent English settlement on the North American continent was established at Jamestown, Virginia. The colony was established by the Virginia Company, and the settlers largely came from Plymouth, England. Jamestown remained the capital of Virginia until 1698, when the State House was burned. After that, the capital was moved to Williamsburg.
Hi, I'm Kay, a musical theater nerd. Are you someone with a deep passion for musical theater? Is your significant other, best friend, or some other special someone in your life someone who knows nothing about it? Does it drive you nuts? If so, join us every Wednesday for Tone Deaf, a theater nerd's guide for their musically challenged spouse, where I subject my husband, Warren,
that's me,
to musicals in front of a captive listening audience.
I'm only slightly scared.
Tune in every Wednesday for Tone Deaf.
Alright, so follow me here for a minute. The year is 1836, and Army Major George H. Crossman has been fighting wars with the Native Americans down in Florida. And he came to the conclusion that horses, while a useful beast of burden, wasn't efficient enough. They had too many issues. They couldn't carry enough, they needed too much food and water, they couldn't handle sand or heat or any of that. And he looked around and he thought, you know what we need? We need camels. So somehow, he managed to convince the army to get him camels. Now, he was not the first U.S. Army major to come up with the idea of getting camels for the Army. That would be Major Henry C. Wayne, who had conducted a much more detailed study, and he recommended it to the War Department, but nobody agreed with him until a senator from Mississippi was appointed as the Secretary of War in 1853. Now, this is where things get really buck wild, because I'd heard about this whole camels in Arizona story before. What I didn't know is that the Secretary of War who went, fuck yeah, let's get some camels up in here, was Jefferson Davis, the soon-to-be President of the Confederate States of America. Yes, that guy, Treason Boy, was the one who said, yeah, camels. So, he actually, on the matter, he said, that they would be very, very useful. They would be, there were a lot of advantages that he anticipated from the use of camels and dromedaries for military and other purposes. And honestly, I can kind of see where they're going. If you bring camels to the deserts in the American Southwest, they would be pretty useful. It would be kind of cool. So in 1855, on March 3rd, the U.S. Congress arranged $30,000 for the project, and thus the Camel Corps was born. So, what, pray tell, is a camel? According to Wikipedia, a camel is an even-toed ungulate in the genus Camelus that bears distinctive fatty deposits known as humps on its back. They're a very popular species for carrying goods and people through desert areas. They were heavily used by nomadic peoples. They still are to this day. In the Middle East, the nomadic peoples of the Middle East use them. They're an instrumental part of their lifestyle. But they are not native to North America. So step one is my boy Major Wayne has to go get some camels. So they head off to the Mediterranean, and they acquire 33 camels. 19 females, 14 males, which should make a small and not very genetically diverse breeding stock, but, well, go off, I guess. So, they bring them to the US, and they set sail for Texas, actually. So they bring our camels to Texas. And then at some point, they were like, well, we need more camels. So they went back out and got 41 more. So now, they're doing a little better. They actually hired some people who knew how camels work, which was something they hadn't thought about before. And, got some people that they hired from the Middle East who actually, specifically from Egypt, who, actually knew how to handle and take care of and properly husband a camel. Because it turns out that, our American Army boys hadn't really seen camels before all that much. So, they set up Camp Verde, which was now the designated camel station, for their 70 camels, which mathematically is interesting to me since they got 34 on the first run and 41 on the second run. That would add up to 75 to me, but the notes here say 70, so I'm going to assume they lost some camels. So they started to set up a breeding program, but then they were informed, no, you need to test the camels first, make sure this whole camel plan works before you start going wild breeding camels. And things really popped off from there. They started having some problems. Like, it worked to a certain degree, but camels are kind of mean in the grand scheme of things. And the other problem that they came up against is the start of the Civil War. So, the major reason that the camel program failed was because when the Civil War broke out and Jefferson Davis, went and committed treason and became the president of the Confederate States, and then the Confederates lost, well, he was the major backer of the camel program, and now nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole because it had the taint of the Confederacy, and we just can't have that. Also, like I said before, the Army was very much horses, mules, carts. They didn't know how to handle an animal like a camel. They're angry. They don't handle like a horse. You can't expect them to do the same things. They're much, they have a very different gait. They have a very different way that you communicate with them, a different way you guide them. Everything is different. The last camel seen in the vicinity of Camp Verde was seen in 1875, and no one really knows what happened to it. But I will note that is the last official sighting of a camel near Camp Verde. Things get interesting after this point. According to later sightings, we have reports of camels in 1913 when the crew of a Santa Fe Railroad train swore they saw a camel near Wickenburg, Arizona. Then we have David Hulton in Ajo, Arizona, seeing a small herd of them near a watering hole in the Cabeza National Wildlife Refuge in 1924. Then we have another traveler seeing one near Banning, California, and then we have more of them seen near the Salton Sea, also in California, all the way through 1941. There's also reports that a camel named Topsy, which was a resident of the Los Angeles Zoo and died in 1934, was also one of these army camels. There are even some reports of people seeing them out there to this day, which leads us to the North American cryptid, southwestern United States camels, which are perfectly reasonable, and is, technically, by definition, a cryptid, because all a cryptid is an animal that cannot be proven or disproven to exist. In this case, we have no proof that there are currently camels living in Arizona, but we also have no proof that there aren't camels living in Arizona, and it's surprisingly reasonable that they would be out there. But I also promised you ghosts, now didn't I? And that story begins back in 1883, near Eagle Creek in Arizona. You'll notice a lot of these stories are in Arizona, even though the camels themselves were in Texas. But honestly, Arizona is a much better climate for a camel than Texas is. Anyway, according to witnesses on this morning in Arizona, two women had gone out. They were doing their chores, and one went to go get a bucket of water while the other was watching the children. And the dogs around the ranch started to bark. And they saw some kind of huge reddish animal come running by, and it had something that looked, they described as devilish but humanoid, strapped to its back as it was running through. And it actually killed the woman who had gone to fetch water. The only things they found, along with her body, were the tracks of cloven hoof prints bigger than a horse and strands of reddish hair. A few days later, near Clifton, Arizona, a party of prospectors heard screams and a thundering of hooves. And when their tent collapsed, they managed to make it out of their tent just in time to see this creature running off in the moonlight, and they found those same cloven hoof prints and strands of red hair. And the stories kept growing and being embellished, and then eventually a farmhand spotted it and tried to lasso the creature and realized it was a camel, and that the thing on its back was a desiccated skeleton. By this point, people who'd been seeing this thing had started calling it the Red Ghost, because it would come up on them and then it would disappear, but anytime it found humans, it would attack. Eventually, a rancher spotted this creature grazing in his garden, and he fired on it with his Winchester rifle, dropped it in one shot, and went over and examined it and determined it was, in fact, the fabled Red Ghost, a camel of the Arizona desert, and found out that the body on its back, the reason it was staying on is that someone had tied it there with strips of rawhide leather. And nobody knows why. No one knows why this person was tied there, whether they were tied there in life as a punishment or whether someone had a camel and a handy corpse, so tied it to the camel and sent it off into the desert. Either way, the camels of Arizona have become something of a legend, as has the Red Ghost itself. And it's just another fun instance of the military establishment finding an animal that could be useful and trying it out for a little bit. But like most of the other ones, except for dogs, it ended up getting left behind by history. The question that remains is whether the camels are still out there. And they well may be. So that's going to do it for this episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can find me at History on Blast on Twitter or at historyonblast@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group, which is the History on Blast discussion group. Feel free to join us. It's a lot of discussion and history memes and talking about episodes. We've actually been planning some of the upcoming content there. We've also got a Patreon now. And while I'm at it, I'd like to thank Kay and Warren from the Tone Deaf Podcast for being my first Patreon donor. Thank you so much. And thanks to them, that means we've hit our first Patreon goal, which means that we're going to start having monthly bonus episodes. My plan is to hit on topics that we've already talked about, but sort of step a bit to the left on a similar subject. So my first Patreon bonus episode is going to be tangentially related to President Evil, Zombie George Washington, but talking about something else in his lifetime. If that sounds interesting to you, you should look for History on Blast at Patreon. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you leave a rating and a review on your podcast catcher of choice, or especially iTunes if you use it. I know not everybody does. As always, I would like to thank Defy the Mall for the use of their song Keeper of Histories for the intro and outro of our program. And as always, thank you for listening.